Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. I'm Emily McCrary Ruiz Esparza. I'm an independent journalist who covers work, the labor market, and women in the workplace. I've written for outlets like The Economist, the BBC, the Washington Post, Quartz, Fast Company, Business Insider, and Digiday's Work Life. And I get to moderate a number of great conversations with experts in the field, like the three that are gathered here today. This webinar is brought to you by Attuned, the AI-driven platform that measures intrinsic motivation and psychological safety. Here's a little bit about them. Attuned shows companies what really matters to their employees by making visible the psychological data that exists around and between people. This allows busy managers to get to know their teams quicker and communicate more effectively, which in turn reduces employee turnover, drives engagement, productivity, and innovation, increases psychological safety, and ultimately builds, I've got the hiccups, guys, ultimately builds happier, more successful organizations. In today's webinar, we'll be discussing how employers can prevent unwanted employee turnover. Voluntary employee turnover can cost companies millions of dollars every year, hours of time and energy, and the stress of overloaded hiring managers and their teams. Gallup estimates that collectively, voluntary turnover costs U.S. businesses more than $1 trillion annually. To replace an employee costs an employer anywhere from 50% to 200% of their salary. According to a report by the Harris Poll released in early 2024, 33% of hiring managers anticipated employee turnover at their company to increase in the year ahead. And according to a report from Gallup that was released in July, 42% of employees who voluntarily left their organization in the past year report that their manager or organization could have done something to prevent them from leaving that job. The same report found that once employees finally decide to leave, they do so very quickly. 77% left within the 90 days after making the decision, usually without telling anyone in the organization. So these people can slip out of your ranks quite quickly and quietly. In this webinar, we'll address why employees elect to leave and what motivates them to enthusiastically stay with their employer, not just reluctantly stick around. Our panelists will recommend policies, practices, and benefits that employers can use to stay competitive and how to take steps to increase retention as early as the onboarding stage. You can also find a link to download Attuned's latest white paper on how to prevent unwanted employee turnover in the chat space now. Today, I'm joined by Dan Kwong, VP of Talent and Culture at Woodward, Brett Browerman, Head of Culture at Feedonomics, and Cynthia Pong, Founder and CEO at Embrace Change. We'll take questions from the audience throughout the conversation today, so please put any questions or comments you have in the chat or via the Q&A section. All right, let's get started. So I'd like for each of our panelists to very briefly introduce themselves and describe a reason that they chose to leave a past employer. We'll start with Cynthia. Welcome.
Great. Thanks so much, Emily. Very excited to be here. I am Cynthia Pong, pronoun she, her, based in New York, and I founded Embrace Change almost 8, 9, 10 years ago now. And we are a career coaching and a training firm. We do specialize in working with women of color, although we do work with folks outside of those identities as well as on the enterprise side. So one reason I left a former employer was burnout. And I really didn't want to go. Like, I wanted to stay there for 10 years. I left after 6, and it wasn't a 90-day turnaround for me. It took almost 3 years for me to really process that I had to do something differently. So I relate to this topic on multiple levels.
Thanks, Cynthia. Dan.
Hey everyone, Dan Kwong. I lead talent and culture for Woodward. We are an action sports company, so think skateboarding, scooter, BMX, skiing, and snowboarding. So very blessed to be able to travel around to our different locations in the US. Currently, I'm based in Lake Tahoe, California, but normally I'm in Salt Lake City and Park City area. And so heavy question, Emily. Thank you for kicking it off. So love to be vulnerable. One reason I left a prior employer was just not seeing growth. Something that I care about for myself is I love to learn. I want to grow. I want to do more. I don't mind longer work weeks as long as I'm having impact. And as soon as I see that's not happening or I don't see the possibilities in the long term, it gets problematic for my future and my employment. So that is why I left a previous job.
Brett.
I love this question. It's great to hear. Everybody has a different experience slightly, and I think that really matters. For me, I was in management consulting before the world of people and culture, and it was very transactional. And so I realized I'm very relationship based, and having clients and moving to the next project, and really everything was about the numbers, not the relationship, was not something that kind of brought me a ton of joy. So that's why I left management consulting in my last company.
Thanks, you guys. All right, before I get into asking our panelists some questions, I do want to put up an audience poll. And the question is this: how confident are you that you know and understand the motivations for voluntary turnover in your organization? So do you know why people are leaving? Like for people to rate this on a scale of 1 to 3. So not at all confident, somewhat confident, very confident. If we could put that poll up, that would be great. And we'll look at the answers a little bit later. So Dan, I want to start with you. Tell us the difference between preventable turnover and unavoidable turnover. So what kind of motivations for leaving are really beyond an employer's control, so we can eliminate those from the conversation for today?
It's that easy, right? No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, absolutely. So I think from the lens of the employer, preventable turnover might be defined as turnover the employee has influence. So I'm using that word intentionally. We all have our own opinions of influence versus control, what we can and can't do with both. So I'm going to come from it with the lens of what can we strongly influence and hope for the outcomes we want. So these are things like starting from the beginning, how we hire, right? How are we hiring? How are we attracting the right talent? How are we making sure, when we talk about the job we're hiring for in the interview process, we're attracting the right talent, but also on both sides, are we aligned on what we're trying to get out of the position? How we onboard, and I don't mean checking IDs, right? How we bring people on board to our company, we can influence that. We can influence how we create a feedback culture, rewards and recognition, and then near and dear to my heart, how do we help create clear career development paths with support, tangible support of what's next, especially with our ambitious folks. So let's jump over to unavoidable. So things that we cannot control and or influence. And I'm going to talk about just voluntary turnover, because involuntary turnover, there are things that, right, more policy driven, right, rules and performance. But I think people may leave because the employee value proposition, right, it may no longer align with the company or what that job offers. Like, things are moving, at least for me, 100 miles an hour. Life changes, right? And so, when someone came into that job, their value proposition, their priorities, what's important to them may be different 2 years later or even 6 months later, depending on the world around them. So that may no longer align. So they may look to leave. An example of that is someone works in a role with a lot of travel. So currently I travel quite a bit, about half the year. But maybe they're looking to start a family. And so that could create some problems, especially if the job isn't flexible at the time and the business can't flex that travel down. So that's an example. Some other motivations you might think about is, maybe someone needs to relocate. Again, from a family standpoint, things change. You may need to move closer to your family, meaning your parents, as an example. And so there might not be the opportunity for remote work. We hear it's in the headlines in a lot of places of asking folks to come back, or requiring and or demanding folks to come back to the office. Not every business is large enough where there's offices and operations where you can maybe plug back in. And so, when there's that misalignment personally and professionally, I see a lot of folks considering and looking for other opportunities.
Cynthia, when you're working with your enterprise clients, do you feel like, actually, and also could you describe a little bit more about the types of companies that you work with and organizations to give our audience some context? But when you work with those enterprise clients, do you feel like they have a realistic understanding of why people in their organization might want to leave?
Right. So the context is we are a bit industry agnostic. So we do work with a range of different companies and organizations on the enterprise side, anywhere from government, nonprofit to corporate and tech. So there's a range. And to answer the question, I mean, I'm forced to give you the very unsatisfying answer of like sometimes, and it depends. I have definitely seen both the situation of where it is clear. It's like I actually just in our leadership network, we've got someone who their supervisor approached them recently and had a conversation like, we see that you're basically kind of like disengaged. How can we actually support you more, because we want you to stay? So there was that identification, that acknowledgement, and the recognition. And I think that's a combination of both high emotional intelligence and being able to pay attention, in the way that Dan is kind of saying, like, to just be aware and intentional to influence these things at all the steps. So that's an employer that was aware. In other cases, people are completely blindsided. I've worked with leaders before where they're like flabbergasted that someone would even consider leaving. And so it really caught them by surprise, just the fact of the people leaving. So if they didn't have a clue at all, how could they even tap into the whys behind that? I think there are, you know, for better or for worse, and it's not even a judgment thing, sometimes we're just out of touch with those things. And it can be, you know, related to all sorts of intersections. Could be generational differences, cultural differences, differences in values, which Brett kind of pointed out before in his kind of like why left a place before. So a lot of factors can compound and exacerbate the knowing or the not knowing, but I've seen both.
The folks who say, I can't even imagine why someone would want to leave this organization, is that just a product of kind of arrogance, or like refusal to acknowledge that there's flaws? I don't know. That just seems so bold.
Yeah. No, it is. And I actually have this is before, kind of before Embrace Change, or like slightly overlapping, but I've actually heard an executive director before be like, this is the best job someone's ever going to have. And I was like, what? How could you say that?
I
How
mean,
could you say that? So,
yourself, right?
yikes. Yeah, I think, you know, there's just a good amount of either blinders, arrogance, projecting our own values and perspective and assuming everyone else is going to have that. But that's not the case. We have to step out of ourselves if we want to be good leaders.
Yeah, in past, I'm a freelancer now, but in past jobs where I've had a very conventional role, and usually I've worked in startups, I tried to avoid not only people who just didn't like the job and wanted to gossip and complain, just because I don't want that vibe in my life. I think it also, they assume that because they're having a negative experience, I will too. Everybody
Right,
else will. And it just,
right.
it kind of poisoned my experience. I don't want someone who's blind and airheaded and everything's great and nothing's wrong here. But it almost feels worse when someone just talks about how horrible it is here and you're going to be miserable and this is going to be terrible.
Yeah,
Everybody down.
yeah. I think that's that combination of like, we all have that psychological negativity bias. So one negative thing takes many positive things to outweigh. And then also just that feel of like gravitational vortex of someone who is like literally demoralizing to the people around them. It's tough.
Mm-hmm. Brett, when you first joined Feedonomics, how did you suss out the most common reasons for attrition within the organization? And how did you make a plan to address those?
Yeah, let me start by saying something slightly controversial, and that is 0% attrition is probably not the healthiest thing for an organization either, right?
Yeah.
Because that's how you learn, right? We left jobs and learned something about ourselves, right? And the game has changed. Our grandparents who might have been in the same job or career, and that was a big part of their identity for 25, 30 years, that's just not where we're living, right? So from a modern people standpoint, you kind of need to plan for a shorter shelf life and that kind of attrition, so that you can learn something from them. So the easy answer here is exit interviews. I learned so much from people learning when I were leaving when I started working at Feedonomics, because it was like, okay, that's a reason that you didn't have the greatest experience. Let me try to tackle that. But the biggest thing is a listening tour, and this is really dependent on the size of the organization. It's much easier when you're smaller and you can try to reach everybody. If you're in a big organization, you really need to be specific with different departments so you can get a well-rounded picture and understand the whole employee experience. But you have to listen to people. And for me, I was able to do one-on-ones. I talked with almost everybody in the company at the time. We were much smaller than we are now. And you can ask them, what are some things that are working for you? What are some things that aren't working for you? What are some things that even better ifs, right? That we don't have that you wish we could have? And you start to pick up on your themes. Ours were pretty direct, right? Like growth path, compensation, right? The things that people want to see from a growing company. You're like, great, we're on the same path here. But if you don't listen to people and you come into a company and you're like, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, people are going to be like, who are you? You didn't ask me what I want, right? And that trust is almost immediately ruined. So we tried to get to a place at our organization of saying, if you don't want to be here, that's okay. I'd much rather them come to us and help them find their next thing rather than someone have to do the dual work, walk on eggshells, also interview at night and feel really uncomfortable, right? That's not beneficial for the business or the individual. But that takes a lot of trust, right? And unless you start off by listening, you're not going to get that trust. So that listening tour was huge. And I know we'll come back to this later, but that even evolved into what we call stay interviews now. We still keep up the one-on-ones. So it wasn't just like in the beginning, tell me what you want, I'm going to tackle it. Because as Dan pointed out, people's needs change. That's going to be different a year or two down the line. And you want to listen again. You don't want to just tell them what they need.
Well, let's talk about stay interviews. Oh, go ahead, Cynthia.
Sorry, can I throw a little wrench into that too? Like an added
Oh, please.
twist, which is that I mean, I think what Brett is saying is so great, both the exit and the stay interviews. And it's also so difficult to truly listen without your own judgments, kind of like, you know, coloring what you're hearing. Because I think there's also, if the trust isn't there, like Brett had pointed out, like that it is there in their case, but like if it's not there, people are not going to say exactly how they feel. And you have to be really good at like listening between the lines and also looking at how they're moving, the behaviors, the actions, the evolution as maybe, because maybe like Dan said, they're going through some kind of a life change and they're not really able to talk to you about it. But I think the listening is so key, and it's like much more than just hearing, you know.
That
Please
was
don't mind.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I
Yeah.
I have an example literally from last week. Right? We have an operations leader who had taken another job out of the industry, right? So not in action sports, not in skiing, snowboarding, and I think it was in sales, which it threw me for a loop. And so I asked, through the leadership team here, actually in this location, I said, what was the thing? Like, why is he leaving? What do we think we know? And the responses I kept getting was pay. I was like, okay, are you sure? You sure it's compensation? Like, that seemed too easy an answer. And so I said, if that's truly the answer, we figured it out, gave him a new offer. And so they said, we really value you beyond this. We want to grow you, a young gentleman. He didn't accept the offer. I'm like, see, hold on. We're not asking the right questions. So I flew in and we met with the GM and the individual, and he was super nervous, right? You can imagine, right? Just VP of HR can scare some people just by the title. And he took a risk and said, you know what? I'm sorry I didn't tell the truth because I was super scared because I don't want to leave. But I think, the problem is I feel stifled and I don't have an opportunity to grow. I want to take on more. I don't feel heard. I see a growth path, but I don't know what that. And so he said, okay, let's chat. What does growth look like? What are you looking to grow in? And 90 minutes later, great conversation. We rewrote his job description. He actually wasn't asking for much more than the counter. It was the same. He said, I want to take on more so I have value if I'm going to get paid more. I mean, that does, and so he's still here. He actually let me in the building this morning. And so it doesn't always happen that way, but you're exactly right? You don't truly know sometimes. And sometimes we won't even get to the answer. If we're lucky, we will. So
I worked in a tech startup once. This was very early in my career. And there was an event manager who was just outstanding. He was one of the best. And the work environment had gotten not great with really, really rapid growth. They hadn't held on to quality. And this event manager, one of the leaders, resigned and had an exit interview with the VP. And I knew what he said because he had told me previously why he was leaving. It was a culture problem. It was toxic. There was too much politics. He didn't have enough say and that kind of thing. And when the VP came out of this meeting, she told the whole team that he left so he could have a job where he could bike to work. It just sort of became lore in the company because it was such a denial. Not only was it a denial of what he said entirely, but it discounted the way the rest of us felt. It refused to acknowledge how the rest of us were feeling. He left for for reasons that we all felt, the rest of the team felt. And so by her refusing to acknowledge that, it was just a blow. It was a blow to everyone. It felt so disrespectful. And I think for a lot of people, it said, this environment's never going to change. They won't even acknowledge the reason people are leaving. People don't leave jobs so that they can bike to work. That's not really typically part of it. It's a little too simple. But anyway, I do want to talk about stay interviews that Brett brought up. Dan, I know when you and I spoke before, you're a big believer in these. What's your philosophy? How do you use them? And how often do you schedule a stay interview?
Yeah, so super important. I have a couple different thoughts to share. I think, stay interviews are instrumental to retaining employees, and it's an opportunity for people just to talk. Back to Cynthia's point, if there is trust, right? And if we're listening and managing all of our 200 biases that we all have as human beings. So it is important. And just asking someone to sit down to do one in itself could be beneficial to driving engagement and certainly driving retention. So a couple of things. I think, there is no one size fits all way to do this. Emily's heard me use that line is in a couple of different settings, meaning depending on the culture of your company, scheduling it and sitting down in this office may not be the right approach. Some companies, yeah, great. So you really need to assess how you do them, and you might not even call them stay interviews because that may scare some people as well. So things to think about. Can you incorporate best practices and the philosophy of a stay interview in one-on-ones? Brett talked about one-on-ones. I am a big believer in one-on-ones, and it shouldn't be, necessarily a punch list of things to do. Having a legit conversation, I think that's important. It could be spread over time, right? So again, I'm in maybe a niche industry, depending on the group in the room, right? So we do go out and go on the chairlift at the ski resort. And so you might take a couple runs and ask a couple questions because some people are uncomfortable. So you need to ease in with the intensity of the question. You may need to ask bits and pieces of questions over the whole winter season in our industry. It may be coffee, it may be lunch. So you really need to adapt that as well. I think also is really setting the stage of, I'm asking these questions to do what? Because I care about you, you add value. I want to make sure you are growing, and we are doing our job as employers, and we are doing our job as leaders. That is why I'm asking these questions, and hopefully that kind of disarms them a little bit, and they'll open up. And then a couple examples of there's so many different ways to do this in different questions. So here's just a couple that I've used in my lifetime. What keeps you here? That may be seemingly simple, but actually that simple can work really, really well depending on your population. And actually some folks haven't even thought about that for themselves. I ask myself that as well. Like, okay, why did I take this job currently? Why do I love this job? What, keeps me going at night and gets me excited to come to work? Some of that self-reflection piece of a stay interview concept actually helps people re-engage, particularly if you have a younger workforce like we do. We skew 18 to 24 in our demo. These are not questions they ask themselves generally. And so it's really good from that self-awareness, self-development, EQ, as Cynthia said earlier. Those are important. Another question that may be, you have to measure this a little bit and read the room. What would cause you to look for another job? Not for every person, but if you have that trust, it can be really powerful because it also, helps people understand, oh, actually my value proposition is 90% there, but this 10% is not quite working. There's a misalignment there. And my manager is asking me to do what it is. Cool. And is it controllable or influenceable? Great. We don't have to wait 2 years or 3 years when they may leave. And then two others, and then I'll pass it maybe to Brett. What can I do as a leader to help you succeed in your role? And how can I make things easier for you or remove barriers? It's broad enough where you could probably, find out a lot more than if you asked a super specific question and narrow in scope. So, to sum up, I think super powerful. Make sure you do it in a way that works for your organization, your culture, and the relationship and trust level you have. And then less is more. Just be really focused about the right questions that really will bring out, some healthy conversation. Essentially, it's feedback. Without calling it feedback. Call it what you will, whatever works for you. So huge fan.
Brett, what would you add? How do you do it at Feedonomics?
What I add, Dan kind of crushed that answer, so I got to figure out if there's anything additional there.
Well, I like what you mentioned in the chat that you title your interviews just saying, hey, it's just kind of non-threatening
Yeah.
in a way.
Yeah, you know, so when I first started and did that needs assessment, it was like onboarding, hiring, let's get that immediate experience, brand awareness out there. Let's draw in talent because we were in a hyper growth stage. And then when we got to the point of doing our first and second engagement survey, we broke it down by tenure and we saw like the people in their first year, they felt super loved. We were all over them, too sticky, honestly. Then everybody year 2+ was a little less happy. And it's like, why, right? We work at this awesome culture. You tell me you're happy, but like, why are these scores a little bit lower? And so I realized like a lot of our attention went to the new hires and the onboarding part, right? We had, I'm not going to say stop paying attention to people that had been here longer, but we said, okay, you're good, right? We still want attention. So these stay interviews became like, okay, now that you've been here for a year, things have calmed down, you feel comfortable. What's next? What are you thinking about? What is still a pain point for you? And so that conversation changed a little bit. On all of my, so we do 15-minute check-ins. We try to do about 300 a year, and we're about a 450 person organization. It has to be scalable. So for one person can't do that anymore. I used to do them all. Now I split them with my team. I even see one of my direct reports on this call, Sarah. She's amazing, and I can't do it without her. So we split it up between people managers and individual contributors. But I do. I put them as saying hey or hi. That's the subject. And I always start by saying, like, we'll talk about work in a second. How are you? How's the human? What's going on in your life? One, so that I can develop that relationship. But two, so that we know whatever work thing that we need to work through, we can work through, right? There's life. There's a bigger picture here. And I don't want to minimize anything that's bothering someone, but I do want them to know that we'll work through it through the context of this 9 to 5 meeting, right? And you can still have a life and I can still root for you. So stay interviews, I think, is super important. You also have to operationalize it, right? Like, what do you do with that information? Dan was talking about this a little bit too. If we have a tough stay interview, and sometimes, you know, you'll pick up on it. Someone immediately just starts throwing out things that they're unhappy about, or they're very cold, which is not typically part of their personality. If you've already built that relationship, you know something's off. So how do you reinforce that feedback loop so something happens with that information and you still maintain that trust, right? If someone says like, my manager and I are just not getting along, I'm not going to go ping their manager as I'm talking with them and saying like, sounds like you're not doing something right. But we do have a breakdown there and I want to make sure that someone knows about it so we can work through it. And so being very intentional about what we do with that information is probably the second piece of that. So we do share bits and pieces from those conversations with our senior leadership team, the department heads. And so we'll label someone like, all good here, no worries, we checked in. Or, hey, this is yellow or red. Like, there's a possible flight risk. I think we should solve this right away. And we do that kind of as much as we possibly can so that we can solve things. If you don't, it will linger and we're human. Resentment will build. And that's where you get to the point of someone looking for another job. And Emily, you mentioned this earlier. When you get in your brain like, I think I'm out of here, you're mentally out as well as physically out. And it's really hard to come back from that.
I'll mention this from the Gallup report I talked about at the top, the one that was released in July. This is a quote from it. 45% of voluntary leavers report that neither a manager nor another leader proactively discuss their job satisfaction, performance, or future with the organization with them in the 3 months before leaving. So clearly this matters to people. Just asking their opinion, talking about how things are going. I think it's just a good endorsement for stay interviews. All right, I want to talk about signals that someone is at risk of leaving. How do you see someone psychologically withdraw? What are the signs and symptoms of that? And then physical withdrawal. We think about absenteeism, but is there another way that that's spotted? We'll start with Brett, but I'd like to hear from all of you on this, actually.
Yeah, Cynthia said something that was spot on. I'm forgetting the exact words, but I'm going to call it detractor behavior. When you start to see some negativity build, especially in one team or within a cluster of people, there's probably a reason there. And think about it, you know, we haven't really gotten into like, why does that matter? Say they bring in a new hire and that new hire's experience is their onboarding buddy or their manager, they're kind of pissed off or disgruntled, right? Like, you're not going to start with a ton of excitement. So that stuff is actually pretty easy to suss out. You know, when people are short in answers or not kind of, we call it going for the gap, right? Like trying to plug in different areas. They just kind of stay in their lane or they only talk to certain people. that shows a lack of emotional investment in their company, probably because they feel a lack of emotional investment in themselves. So I think you start to see that more at the interpersonal level than you really do anywhere else. Now, if you start to see performance indicators, right, like they're not doing what they're asked or it's really subpar, that's also an indicator. But a lot of the times that comes after the emotional piece, in my opinion, or my experience. But I'd love to hear what Cynthia and Dan have to say about this.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. And, if we're really honest about it, all of our decision making, as rational as we may be trying to be at any point, it's always rooted in some kind of, on a base level, some emotional, feeling or something. And a lot of what I heard when Dan and Brett were sharing just now too is like, and Emily, you as well, people want to know that they matter. Like the people that you want to retain in an organization or a company, they want to contribute. They want to know that they're bringing value. It's like the growth path thing that Dan talked about for himself and for this other person. And like we just have to make sure that that is kind of like communicated in various ways, both privately, I think, and publicly matters too. But yeah, I mean, it's just the emotional switch will then lead to certain little indicators. Maybe somebody used to do something, but now their behavior has changed. I feel like there's usually kind of some flips like that, or you just kind of sense that there's a little extra distance, or it could be that growing resentment that Brett talked about. But those types of things, if we are present enough as leaders to key into that, I think it's there's often indicators and we just have to be able to pick up on it.
Yeah, I agree. There are indicators and they may look different depending on the person and what their motivations and styles are. And certainly even something not simple, but something such as language may shift. As an example, say you've got a high performing team, really the growth mindset using, words that are more positive and inclusive. That word choice may change in someone who may be struggling from thinking about the next opportunity. And psychologically, Brett mentioned EQ, maybe their EQ isn't as strong or they are drained that they can't manage their EQ as strongly. Using victim language, less ownership, maybe even as explicit as finger pointing and blaming. So changing, like a change in someone's words over time, that could be a signal that they need help, or talk to them and say, hey, how are you doing? Right? What's going on? But I do want to touch on something too. There may be signals that don't exist. And let me talk through that. There could be folks they don't change their language. They are still high performing. They even take on more. They're still working however many hours. But they might be looking to leave. And the why behind that could be that they care so much about how they leave and their reputation when they leave, their work product, their legacy. They might go over index on the other way and work even harder. So again, maybe not as common, but just you never know. Just be aware there may be folks who do care about it and they've made hopefully a rational decision to move on, but also very much are contributing and high performing to the strategic plans and the deliverables.
Yeah, I'll put this to the audience too. If anyone wants to comment in the chat how they measure or monitor for signs of oncoming turnover. Is it stay interviews, engagement survey? I mean, there's just a bunch of different tools. I'd be curious to know what people are using. Cynthia, I want to come to you on this question and talk about the most common reasons the individuals, you work with enterprises, but you also work with individuals, as you mentioned at the top. The most common reasons that individuals you work with cite for wanting to leave an organization. And I will put up, you don't have to speak directly to this, but this is an illustration from Attuned's white paper on voluntary turnover that I thought was very helpful to organize the types of leavers that exist. And it is this. So enthusiastic leavers, reluctant stayers, stayers, and reluctant leavers. Do you feel like folks fall into these categories, Cynthia? What kind of reasons are they citing?
Yeah, I do. And I really love, I love any kind of matrix or like organizing format. So I think this really covers a lot of it. And I had put in the chat, I think it was Dan who was just sharing, but yes, the kind of like self-victimizing thing, like I can't do this because, always looking to outside factors for like why someone is limited in some kind of way. That is very characteristic of the side on the right of this diagram of the low control, employees low control part. And so that's when you're going to have the either reluctant stayer or reluctant leaver, um, both of which I think have downsides to them. But to answer your question more directly, this is really well illustrated, and I swear we didn't prep this. I didn't know these stories ahead of time, but it's really well illustrated by Dan's point earlier, which is that it's usually not the pay, it's usually not the compensation that somebody is leaving for the folks that we tend to work with. And, that's because the individuals we tend to work with do skew a little bit more mission driven, values driven, like Brett was talking about at the beginning, like that values misalignment with like, let's care about relationships and perhaps like people over profits or, things like that. So what it usually is, and what we generally hear, I'll just say kind of three common ones. One is the classic people don't quit a company, they quit a boss or a supervisor issue. So direct clashing with the direct manager or supervisor, feeling like the supervisor doesn't support them, doesn't value what they bring to the table, is not communicating that explicitly or implicitly, and is not invested in their growth. Things that we've kind of heard as themes already here too. Sometimes it's the supervisor actually actively undermining them, or occasionally we do hear about the very intense things of like, my boss actually yelled at me, or like things like that. And it's a recurring thing. It's not usually just a one-off. Second one, another common one is that there's not opportunities to grow, to take on more, to like feel like they're able to grow their own personal development, their own professional development, their own leadership. So, Dan had mentioned that with that example. And then the third would be like, I would say a mismatch or misalignment with the work itself or what the company is doing itself. So, some kind of misalignment on either values, like Brett was saying, or their own career mission, what they're trying to actually achieve at the end of the day might be misaligned. I'll just give a little twist anecdotally here because we do work with predominantly women of color and people of color. A lot of times we have people who they might have taken their first job or chosen their first career because of what their family, parents, cultural pressures, things like that, like the meal plan, if people are familiar with that, medical, engineering, accounting, or law, like you got to do one of those. And so there may be something like that. And then it ends up being a pivot out to another type of work that they would rather be doing, and it's not so much about the organization. So I'd say those are kind of some three very common buckets that we see.
What would you say is the effect of an enthusiastic leaver? How is that going to change a workplace environment? Are they typically vocal when they're leaving? Does that make other people want to leave?
I mean, maybe to some extent, I think I know folks who like people around them kind of know, maybe not like leadership, but people around them kind of know, okay, like there's sort of like a timeline with this person, which is not necessarily a bad thing either. I think Brad had raised the point before about like you do want some attrition and movement. Stasis is not the goal here. Um, I think it could cut either way though, Emily. Like sometimes people, the enthusiastic leaver could be like, they're just really on their own like escalator and they want to rise to the top, like that's kind of their pathway. I actually think of, I don't know if, well, I won't say any particulars, but there's somebody that I kind of admire out there, and I've looked at their career path or whatnot, like on LinkedIn, and they're like the youngest CEO, woman of color in a large corporation and stuff. And you can see that pattern of like every 1 to 2 years, there's a change and they're moving up in the ranks. I think that can be motivating to some people, honestly, because it could galvanize them to like put in more and actually contribute to that company more. There's also the other side of it. Like if they're enthusiastically leaving because things are horrible, like the situation you described, Emily, then that could be one of those keystone people who leaves and then like suddenly there's a bit of a mini exodus. So it could really go both ways from the enterprise point of view.
Brett, what have you seen with enthusiastic leaders and how that enthusiastic leavers, not leaders, leavers, and how that changes a culture on a team or in a company?
A big part of our job that we haven't spoken about is change management, right? We have to be the bridge between leadership that makes decisions, usually based on the bottom line, and our workforce, who we're trying to retain. And so when you have turnover, you would like to be as transparent as possible, but it's much easier to tell a story when there is a exit that's a good reason, right? And um, typically, right, we like to hire great people with high EQ. They know what's happening. So if they start to see a whole bunch of attrition, they're going to also start to feel like, why is everybody leaving? Red flag. I got to figure this out, right? Like, and all of a sudden you have a perception issue, and it's really hard to control the narrative when you want people to talk to each other. You don't want to be that person. It's like, stop talking about this. Now, if you have some enthusiastic leavers, we had someone who is a really high performer who left to change industries. He wanted to be a cop. And it's like, that is awesome. If someone's going to leave here, I can't wait to support you. And you have a different conversation, right? You can shout them out and make sure that they feel loved. You have an exit interview that's positive and constructive. You can ask them to be an advocate for your brand, right? Like, hey, would you mind writing a Glassdoor review so we can continue to recruit in. That person was in New York, for example. Lots of New Yorkers, right? So you have a lot more to work with. Now, the one thing on the opposite side of things, when someone's enthusiastically trying to leave because they're unhappy, that one's tough. I've been there, right? When you hear the phrase like, oh, this company is screwed if I leave, that's probably burnout. I've said that before, and I'm like, okay, I'm throwing a temper tantrum because I'm a little burnt out. I need some vacation. But that is something that you can tinker with, right? Like you can then turn that into a listening opportunity, right? Like especially if it's coming from one team. We have a whole bunch of people like saying this isn't the best place to work, or if they all leave, the company's screwed, right? Like the world goes round. If any of us leave, the company hopefully will do well because of the things we put in place. But we definitely have something that we can work with there. That is a feedback loop happening. In the way that we want? No, but it is happening, and we can pay attention and try to do something about it. I like enthusiastic leavers, as weird as that sounds, because they're vocal. So if you have that feedback, there is something to do with it. Now, if someone is very quiet and really unhappy and they're not engaging with the nonverbal or verbal feedback loops, there's very little to do with that except for hope that you get some good feedback from an exit interview. So again, it's like operationalizing your one-on-ones. Like this is something you can operationalize and think about as like, okay, we're just pushing the organizational development forward, and let's gather all the juicy bits that we can and do something with them.
Cynthia brought up the ability to kind of move multiple times, maybe every 1-2 years. I interviewed yesterday one of the very high ups, like she's not CHRO, but she's a step down at HEB, which is the huge grocery store chain in Texas. They're only in Texas. So if you haven't seen them, that makes sense. They have 150,000 employees, and grocery has famously high turnover, not just for hourly employees, but for corporate employees too. And she's been at the company for 30 years, which is very abnormal. And I asked her, what's one of the reasons? And that's what she described. She said, every 2 to 3 years, I've gotten to try something new. And she's been a part of picking that thing. Some, they guided her and said, we want you to take this on because we want you to start this new thing or lead this new thing, which was a huge compliment. But she said, I've never gotten bored. Every 2 to 3 years, I got to try something entirely new. Maybe her job description didn't change. Maybe her title didn't change, but her job description changed. And she's gotten to work across all parts of the company. And so I thought that was a really good example of never having time to get bored, always getting to try something new. Okay.
Yeah.
Dan, oh, go ahead.
No, I think that's brilliant as a kind of retention strategy for your high performing folks or whatnot. And it made me think of, I can't remember who said it earlier, but there's basically this thread of like being collaborative with your employees. And the fact that that person it was like they were partnered together to be, at least for some of the parts, where she was going to go and stuff. I think that makes sense. And I've seen certain companies it's usually at a certain level, like, okay, you're director, senior director, then we start to move you around different verticals or whatnot to see if you go up to VP and things like that. That's a great carrot organizationally for a lot of people who are motivated to do that, and they do want to have the variety, because it can be hard to do one thing for a long time.
Dan, describe for us the elements of company culture that are most likely to retain workers. What has to exist, do you think?
Yeah, certainly it's not because I said so, but I think kind of going off of what Cynthia is talking about, I think when we talk about growth or a culture of progression or learning, insert your word here. And we certainly have that here, right? We're in action sports. We work with 4-year-olds all the way up to 70, 80-year-olds on skateboards. And so internally, I think that's important. So not only because people don't want to get bored, but in order to grow the organization, to add value and find impact, fostering that internally is huge, right? The folks on the front line, or what I say, like mid-level manager who has one of the most difficult jobs in the world, I think, they see where they can add value. They see where they can grow. We just need to create the mechanisms, the structures, and the relationships for people to tell you and give you that data. So culture progression, learning, absolutely important, whether it's structured or not, right? I love this whole partnering of, I think IDEO had a whole conversation years ago around like, how do you design the life you want or the job you want along those lines? Look it up. I think there's a TED Talk from IDEO. But the other one that I wanted to talk about was around a culture of inclusion and belonging. And there's lots of words for it. We use the word connection. I think being able to intentionally create connections with all sorts of people in all stages and touch points in the employee life cycle, I think is really, really important. And we see a lot of people leave in their first year because they don't feel connected, because they're not clear on who they are and how they fit in or not, or add value in the organization. There isn't a strong connection with the brand. So if you're a brand forward or focused company like ours, I'm not an action sports guy, by the way. I do not skateboard at all. But I'm still very strongly connected to the culture. If that isn't established in the first 3 to 6 months, people are going to get lost and say, like, why am I here? People don't see me. I'm different, right? I dress differently. Why does Dan have a button-down shirt? He should wear a t-shirt. So those are important for inclusion. Things also around being sure that people know how they add value and how their job description comes alive in real life in a way that leverages diverse talent, right? We talk about diverse talent, and that's great, and diverse experiences, but it's also tricky to help people translate that in practice. It's hard. It can be hard, small companies and big companies, because there are subcultures and really trying to like figure out, how to move into a new organization that can be kind of clicky depending on where you are and what your organization's like. So ultimately, I think developing a culture where diverse populations can feel connected to each other is super powerful. And it's also one of the biggest levers to retain talent. And oftentimes I see great initiatives on the front end of hiring and recruiting diverse talent. And then what happens? They leave. Diverse talent leaves because the culture isn't there yet. And chicken or the egg, I think it's both. You got to do both at the same time. But creating a culture where people feel valued, people feel seen and heard, and can do their best work. Awesome. Like that's a great place to focus. And that goes back to what Cynthia said, listening. We think it's so simple. It is simple and it's not. But truly listening, everyone, and then building off of that goes a long way. You might say, oh, we're too busy. Well, I call, excuse me, BS. Like we are all too busy. Take the time. It doesn't take, right? Was it 5 minutes, Brett? Like 15 minutes? Like 15 minutes is days and hours and dollars on the other end by spending that time.
Brett, what would you add the elements of company culture that are likely to retain workers? You have a very high retention rate at Beatonomics currently. To what do you credit that success?
A great people team. I'm just kidding. Pride. That's the only thing that I would add to what Dan said, right? Like we want to go to a happy hour and meet new people and be proud of the work that we're doing. I'll be the first to say I work in an e-commerce company. E-commerce is not what wakes me up in the morning. It's the people and the communications and relationships that we have. Yeah, I think the answer to your question more directly is like we as a people team have to shift, right? What I've learned in the last few years is that everything kind of has a shelf life. The programs and culture initiatives to foster that connection that Dan was talking about, what we did when we were 150 people isn't working at 450 people and global and fully remote, which we are now. So we had to shift. If we had continued to do what we did in the beginning and said, people, why aren't you showing up to this event? Or why aren't you doing coffee chats without us asking? They're just gonna be like, I don't know, I'm not inspired to. But if we continue to listen and then shift our priorities or programs or initiatives, whatever words you want to put in there, to fit the modern needs of where we're at, right? Meet people where they're at, they'll respond. And they'll respond one way or the other. If they respond negatively, that's okay. That's a response. That is them talking back to you, and do something with that. I'd much rather that than silence. We've probably all facilitated large calls where people just stare at you, just silent. You're like, okay, well, I'll just fill the space because that's what I'm paid to do. So, everything Dan said really, really resonated with me, and it's about scaling it and trying and letting it go. There are a lot of things that I tried at the beginning that I was like, this is perfect. This is going to solve your problem. And then when it kind of stopped working, I was stuck in my ways of, why isn't this working? This is what it was there for. But really, I think we have retention because we listened to our employees and said, okay, fine, it's not working anymore. Let's try something new. And then we'll use a vehicle like an all hands to explain why we did it, how we're going to evaluate it, engagement survey, or what that shelf life looks like. And then all of a sudden, I think people feel a lot more invested in or a part of the company journey rather than just a bystander who's going to be told how it's going to go.
You mentioned scale, Brett, and the Feedonomics has grown quite a bit in recent years. So how do you prevent turnover while at the same time trying to grow a workforce? So some of that I would imagine is just making time, but if the people team has to be focused on onboarding, you mentioned first year folks were getting a lot of attention. How do you retain everyone at the same time while growing quickly?
Honesty. That's been a big tool for us that often seems overlooked. We've had some organizational shifts, right? We got acquired almost 3 years ago now, and that's a big change for an organizational culture, especially one that is founder-led and crunchy like we were. All of a sudden, it's about a public company tied to a stock price. Like, how do you fit into that? So the same language that we were using in the beginning, people would have seen right through that if we tried to just be like, everything's the same. Like, that's not true, right? Like, there are things that are different, but we can control them. Here's what's happening. Here's the changes you might see. And so then you might get a team or department kind of caught in the crosshairs, right? Like, well, what is my priority? How do I work with the parent company? Which system do I use? Those are very valid questions. Sweeping them aside and being like, deal with it. I don't know. Like, keep doing what you're doing is like not what they want to hear or what they want to feel. It's, okay, look, it's okay to not be okay right now. I hear you. Let's see what we can get on the roadmap, and just be realistic with those people, because then all of a sudden they feel like a change agent with you rather than just someone who's going to be like, just tell me when it's going to get better. So honesty of like, it's okay, I hear you. This is not great right now. We need to make some changes. And then you go ahead, you do another listening tour, maybe a little more specific that time. All of a sudden, those people are now going to advocate with you, not against you quietly, right? Yeah, it's hard, right? Like, you have to strike that perfect balance between here's exactly what's happening and here's a business objective. But if you don't bring those people along for the ride with you, they're gonna leave along the way.
Dan, have
I'd
you
love to
found
share.
Oh, go ahead,
Oh,
please. Jump
no,
in.
maybe you're going to ask me. You asked the question and then I'll
Well,
weave it
actually,
in.
I was going to change gears a little bit. So
Oh,
answer
okay.
which you prefer. You go ahead first.
Yeah, for sure. So, we're going through an interesting time at Woodward. We're owned by a parent company called Powder, privately family owned, incredible culture. Part of that portfolio is being divested. So there's an interesting tension. So we're divesting part of the portfolio, right? We're selling off some of the ski resorts, and then growing the other parts of the portfolio that is action sports and national parks, like Zion and Death Valley. And so from a retention standpoint, it's giving a lot of mixed messages. And so we're dealing with that now as an organization. We're like, hopefully you'll still be with us, but maybe not if it's sold next week. So what we're trying to focus on is what's not changing. I think, Brett, you mentioned change management quite a bit. Yeah, that is pretty much 9 to 5 and then some, right? And so really identifying and having conversations around, hey, there's a lot of scary news, there's a lot of uncertainty, but what do we know to be true, at least at this point? We know that we're still, growing the outdoors. We're still taking care of guests. We still have our passion for teaching people how to ski and snowboard and skate. Awesome. That isn't changing. So let's focus on that, what we can influence. And then if and when, those ski resorts get acquired, then we'll talk about what that means. And also, right, what that means for you with the parent company, or if it's privately bought and all that. So sometimes our job is to simplify the best we can to get people to focus on areas that they can actually control and influence and not spin out of control.
Perhaps the most important question that I will ask today, Brett, what is your dog's name?
Kobe. This is a paid actor back here. He's never this chill. If you ask anybody that knows him, this is a lie, but it looks really good on camera.
It does. Cynthia, I want to pose this question to you. Why do companies fail to make the changes that are necessary to prevent turnover? We already mentioned at the beginning, just sort of obstinance, refusal to acknowledge that things are going wrong. What are the other characteristics of a company that just fails to do this?
I know, and isn't that the trillion-dollar question here? I mean, I think the reason that it's happened historically and continues to happen now, I was thinking about this. I think it comes down to kind of like a few buckets of factors. One is like the strategic failure. So that's sort of related to what you're saying and what everybody's raised here. Like focusing on short-term goals, the temptation to prioritize profits and all of that stuff over thinking about the long-term retention, long-term growth. What is the pathway for the company and individuals? Because like Dan pointed out, is going to save the dollars down the line. We rationally may know what we should be doing, but like it's just not happening. And I think there's also especially so much happening these days. Really, I think it puts a lot of top leadership into a bit of reactive mode around things, which is kind of a strategic challenge to not do that and to maintain and be able to pull out, okay, well, these are the things that are still going to be stable and secure. And kind of a side note, but the thing I hear the most about people and our clients and like why they go for certain jobs is the stability, the security, like that is so important to people. And if we can't promise that at a company enterprise level, okay, fair, but like what can you still say? I think when you're doing a lot of things Brett had said, people will give you a lot of grace around, okay, you can't predict what's going to happen next quarter in the economy, but like they know that there's this connection and communication. That's enough. Two, briefly, we don't like change. I mean, I called my business Embrace Change as a daily call in to myself to resist it less, but like we can't always be like, I want things as they were. Like, let's just try to go back to whatever pre-pandemic, all this stuff. It's not happening. So we got to adjust to that. And then finally, I think sometimes there's actually just larger systemic issues. Exactly. Change is the one constant. Some systemic issues where certain companies, especially like nonprofits, government entities, agencies like that, there's literally just not the resources, not the systems, very embedded culture that's anti this, not the human power to make certain improvements and do things like Brett and Dan have both said. And so that's just not going to keep some of the enthusiastic levers and stuff like that. So I kind of think of it in those three buckets.
We are at the top of the hour. Brett, Dan, and Cynthia, thank you so much for being here. Practical advice. This is great. I love the anecdotes. I also love the philosophical bits that you guys have been able to share. Each of you are so experienced in what you do. This has been really helpful. Thanks to our audience also for joining us today. As a reminder, this webinar has been brought to you by Attuned, the AI-driven platform that measures intrinsic motivation and psychological safety. If you'd like to learn more about how Attuned can enhance communication within your organization, visit attuned.ai. Thank you again to all of our panelists and to our audience. Stay well.
Thank you.